Over 9 months ago, when this debate started, there wasn't a single dollar guaranteed for public and community housing. Renters were being completely ignored. And now, 9 months later, there is $3 billion going out the door for public and community housing, and renters have found their voice as a result of Greens' pressure and fighting back against the Labor Party and a government that wanted to ignore the one-third of this country who rents and were refusing to spend a single extra dollar on public and community housing. Today, the Greens have secured an extra $1 billion for public and community housing in addition to the $2 billion we secured via the social housing accelerator. That means there will be thousands of people in this country, thousands of families, single mums, pensioners, people waiting decades for a public and community home who will get to move into that home with a roof over their heads because the Greens stood up and fought. That $3 billion will mean roofs over their heads for thousands of families waiting for a public and community home. What we weren't able to secure is a freeze and cap on rent increases. And the bottom line is we weren't able to convince the Labor Party to care about the one-third of this country who rents. But the message I want to send to the millions of renters across this country is this: we will not stop fighting. We will not rest until we get a cap and freeze on rent increases. We know your pain. We know that every time your rent goes up, that means either eviction onto the street or making tough choices at the supermarket. We know the anxiety and fear that comes with that lease renewal and that potential rent increase. The Greens are the party of renters. We are the party now who represents renters in Parliament. And I think what the Labor Party needs to realise is if they keep ignoring renters, if they keep refusing to budge on capping and freezing rent increases, they will learn a very harsh lesson at the next election. There are state, local and then federal elections coming up over the next few years, and every one of them will be a referendum on whether or not the government cares about renters. And if they continue to refuse to freeze and cap rent increases, then they will learn what happens when you ignore the one-third of this country who rents. For the Greens' part, we will continue to fight. There are future bills coming up, and what I hope this demonstrates, not just to everyone here, but to the crossbench, to housing organisations who called on us just to pass the Housing Australia Future Fund as it was. Well, if we had listened to them, we wouldn't be standing here celebrating $3 billion for public and community housing. So next time a housing bill comes before Parliament, maybe trust that what the Greens are doing is fighting for things that are possible, that can happen, and that when the government says they're impossible, like when they said it was impossible to find extra money for public and community housing, well, maybe trust that the Greens are fighting for something that is possible. Because we turned zero guaranteed dollars for public and community housing this year to $3 billion.
Max, when Labor announced the extra $2 billion, you said that you wouldn't sell out renters. So did you recommend this deal to the party room, or were you wrong?
I'm not going to talk about the elements of party room, but I hope it's been pretty clear that myself, along with Adam, in front and centre in this housing debate, I've said time and again, that we were willing to negotiate in good faith with the government. What we weren't willing to accept was the government coming up after that $2 billion and saying nothing more after that. Well, we pushed and we fought and we got an extra $1 billion for public and community housing. And let me be very clear, this campaign has just started. There are other housing bills coming before Parliament right now, and what we have proved to the country is when the Greens stand up and fight, people get outcomes. There are people with roofs who will have roofs over their heads because the Greens stood up and fought, and now we're going to fight to secure a freeze and cap on rent increases.
Wasn't this the best opportunity to get a rent freeze deal?
Not at all. There is future. We know that there is other housing legislation that will be coming before this Parliament, and we recognise we're pragmatic. We understand we're not going to solve the entire housing crisis in one bill, but what we do know is that every time a bill comes up, we will fight as hard as we can to extract more concessions from the government to materially improve the lives of renters and people waiting for public and community housing.
Didn't the Greens say?
I'll go there in a minute.
Didn't the Greens say they wouldn't pass this legislation without action on a rent freeze or a rent freeze?
No, the Greens said we were willing to negotiate in good faith. We wanted two things. We wanted extra funding for public and community housing, and we wanted action for renters. Well, we've secured funding for public and community housing, and now we turn our attention to fighting for a freeze and cap on rent increases. Well, we haven't stopped. Let's be very clear. There is future legislation coming up right now, and over this term of Parliament that we will use to secure and push for a freeze and cap on rent increases. look, ultimately, we're pragmatic. We know we're not going to be able to get everything that we want, but I think this should be a very clear message to the population, to the 1/3 of this country who rents. There is one party throughout this entire process who made it very clear that we were fighting for a freeze and cap on rent increases, and another party who was refusing to do so. Now, if it's the case that it's going to take a federal election and Labor losing the votes of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of renters, for them to learn that they can't ignore the 1/3 of this country who rents, then so be it. That's what elections are for. And frankly, if we aren't able to push Labor to freeze and cap rent increases before the next election, then I think they will learn a very harsh lesson about what happens when you ignore the 1/3 of this country who rents.
Last question before UT, last question.
One of the really major issues for you was a freeze and cap on rent increases. How disappointed are you that you weren't able to get that?
Oh, look, let's be very clear. Over the next 12 months, there is going to be another $4.9 billion worth of rent increases. And now that's the Labor Party's fault. That's the Labor Party's fault. They had the power at National Cabinet to freeze and cap rent increases, and they refused. They saw the pain that renters are suffering, and they decided to do nothing for them. Yeah, that makes me upset and angry. But I should also be clear that this fight is not a fight to fundamentally change the relations between the property industry and property developers and 1/3 of this country who rents. It's not going to be won in a few weeks. We understand and we're pragmatic. It may well end up taking years. Now, if we get to the next election, and maybe this is what it's going to take, and Labor lose a bunch of new seats to the Greens because they ignored the 1/3 of this country who rents, then so be it. That may be what needs to happen. I hope that's not the case. I hope Labor come to their senses before then, and we'll certainly keep fighting for that.